Hi, this is Dave Hompes again. Just here to talk about testing methods for H. pylori today. And there are several different methods to test for H. pylori. Some have advantages and disadvantages, and so finding the right method of testing for you is quite important. It's quite important that you understand what the pros and cons are of some of these tests, and also to introduce you to some of the testing that you can do at home without the need to go to a doctor, and the relative merits of that kind of testing as well. So let's get into it. The first test that, or I'm going to start by actually grouping the tests into two categories: invasive and non-invasive. And so the invasive tests include a blood test and an endoscopy. So with a blood test, you will need to go to see a doctor or a clinic. They will take a sample of blood in the usual way from the arm, and they will analyse it for antibodies to H. pylori. It's important to understand that they're not looking for H. pylori organisms in the blood. They're looking for your body's immune response to the organism. So if you have H. pylori, your body will make antibodies, and so that's what they're looking for. Now, that's a good test if it's the first time. So if you're looking to see whether you have H. pylori, it's not a bad test. But you can't use that test to retest once you've had treatment for H. pylori, whether it's antibiotics that your doctor prescribes or herbs that you may get from a natural practitioner. The reason is that the antibody levels stay elevated for up to 5 or 6 years in some cases in people who have had H. pylori. So just because the antibody levels are high, it doesn't mean you actually have an active infection. Very, very important. So the blood test, not too bad to start off with if you're checking to see whether you have H. pylori, does not tell you whether your infection is necessarily active, and completely useless for retesting. Okay. The second testing method that is invasive is something called an endoscopy. With an endoscopy, you will actually lie on your side on a hospital bed or a bench, and they will insert a plastic tube with a camera on the end down your esophagus into your stomach. They'll take a look around your stomach using the camera to find out whether there is any red, inflamed, irritated tissue, and that's what they use to diagnose things like gastritis and ulcers. So it's very good for picking out the physical damage that has been done to your digestive tract. The endoscopy procedure may also find whether you have potential tumour growth, or also a hernia as well, a hiatal hernia, which can also cause symptoms that are similar to H. pylori. In using the endoscopy, sometimes the doctors will take a snip of tissue or several snips of tissue from your stomach, and that's called a biopsy, and they'll analyse the biopsy tissue to see if they can find H. pylori organisms. So that's a very accurate test, and it does something that none of the other tests can do, which is look for physical damage like ulcers in your digestive system. The problem is it's very stressful, it's unpleasant, and you have to have a clinic visit. The third method of testing is non-invasive. You still need to go to a clinic to have this done. It's called a breath test or a urea breath test. So you will literally drink a liquid and then blow into a bag. And what they do is they analyse the gases in your breath for the evidence of the presence of H. pylori. Now, recent research seems to suggest that the breath test is probably the least accurate of all the testing methods for finding H. pylori, and I have that information in my files to email you if you want to see that. So the breath test's okay again, but in my experience, I've also found in a lot of cases false positives and sometimes false negatives as well with the breath test, particularly in younger and smaller people. There seems to be a problem with the breath test in that category of people. The fourth test is again non-invasive, and it's called a stool antigen test. Quite simply, you provide a stool sample, and the scientists in the lab will analyse it for something called antigens, normally using some specific staining techniques, and that will indicate the presence of H. pylori. Now, the beauty of the stool antigen test is that it tells you whether you definitely have an active infection. If that test is positive, there is no doubt whatsoever you have an H. pylori infection. The second main advantage with that kind of test is that you don't actually need to have a clinical visit. You can order test kits now from some very sophisticated and high-tech labs that are able to run these stool antigen tests for you. I have a couple of examples here. This one is just an H. pylori test, and just to give you some example of what you need to do, not a very pleasant thing to talk about, but you take a stool sample, you put it in something like a Tupperware container, and then you pick parts of the stool out with this fork which has spikes on the end, and you literally mix it round in the tube, pop it back in the box, and then send it off to the lab, and the lab analyzes it for H. pylori. Now, in my experience, people who have H. pylori regularly often have other infections or bacterial overgrowths in their digestive systems, and sometimes that means that even if they clear the H. pylori, the symptoms just don't go away, because the H. pylori wasn't really causing all the symptoms, it was something else. Just to give you some examples, I actually have here a test from a male. Just looking at for his age here, it's not actually on here, it's irrelevant anyway, but he had H. pylori, as you can see at the bottom. Well, you probably can't see, but here it says H. pylori detected. You'll also see here that it says Candida albicans detected. Now, Candida albicans is a yeast and fungal organism that can cause the same symptoms as H. pylori, and in fact, studies show that if you clear H. pylori using antibiotics, or if you use antacid medications like Prilosec, Nexium, Tagamet, or even some of the over-the-counter ones like Gaviscon and Rene, Candida albicans will grow in your stomach up to 300 to 400 times greater than it would normally do, okay? Or should I say 300 to 400% higher levels. So that's very interesting. It's also very interesting to see that sometimes people come along thinking they have H. pylori. When we run the test, we find a different infection. In this case, Cryptosporidium was found. And Cryptosporidium is a diarrhea-causing bug. It can cause heartburn, it causes digestive inflammation, and it's very, very similar to H. pylori in the symptoms it can cause. This was a different test I ran on another client, and this one came up with Giardia lamblia, which is another organism similar to Cryptosporidium that can cause digestive symptoms. So the great thing about the stool antigen test is that you can just upgrade the test, and instead of having just one tube in the box, you end up with 5 or 6 tubes in the box, as you can see here, different coloured tubes, and they will analyse the stool sample for all these different infections, which is fantastic because it means that you're able to get a much bigger picture of what's going on in your digestive system. And these tests are great for people at home because often members of the same family can have the same infection. So if you find H. pylori in the dad or the mum, the son and the daughter have it. If you find infections in one partner, the other partner often has H. pylori or some of the other organisms because they're easily passed in saliva and things like that, and with sexual contact. Very recently, I started using another test. Again, it's a stool test kit, but it's kind of the Rolls-Royce of stool tests. So it not only looks for the organisms, but it also looks at how many of the good bacteria you have in your system. It looks at how well you're digesting your fats and your proteins. It looks at how much inflammation is in your stomach and in digestive system. It looks for bacterial overgrowth that is very hard to find using some of these other tests. You know, it looks for IgA levels, which is a direct marker of your immune system function in the digestive system, and it looks for certain food sensitivities as well. So using these tests, I'm able to find organisms that your doctor may not know about or may not search for, and I've found these tests are priceless and invaluable tool in helping people locate the source of their digestive troubles. So I just wanted to give you a little overview of those tests. Just to recap, the blood test for H. pylori only looks for H. pylori. It's useless for retesting, but it's good sometimes for identifying an infection if it's the first test you do. The endoscopy procedure is great because it is able to find physical damage to your digestive system that none of the other tests do, like ulcers, like hernias. But it's uncomfortable, a stressful experience, and you need to go to a clinic. The third test is the breath test. It's okay, but we find quite a lot of false positives and false negatives with it. And again, it requires a visit to your doctor. The stool test is able to identify many, many different organisms and give you a much bigger picture of what's happening in your digestive system. And you don't necessarily need to have a clinic visit in order to order one of these tests. And if you want to order one of these tests from me to see what's going on, just drop me an email through the contact page and I'll be happy to help you out with with regard to that. So I hope you've enjoyed this little short video snippet of information about how you can test for these infections and find out the root of your problem.